Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Tremper Longman. Tremper Longman did his PhD at Yale University, and he's a distinguished scholar and professor emeritus at Westmont College. And he's the author of a new book, Confronting Old Testament Controversies. Dr. Longman, thank you for talking with me.
Hey, thank you so much. Feel free to call me Tremper, Sheb.
All right. So there are a number of books, it seems like, that have come out in the past few years that have tried to address puzzling or controversial issues in the Old Testament. And, here's another one. I'm curious to hear your desire in writing this book or your motivation for writing this book, what you felt like was needed.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I was asked by my publisher, Baker Books, to write it. And matter of fact, it took them 2 or 3 years to talk me into writing it. And it has a kind of a specific intention that I haven't seen in other books. Not that there's not a lot of overlap or that there are not other good books out there, but I was specifically asked to address some of the writings of some of my evangelical friends and colleagues who have begun to kind of push the boundaries on certain issues, particularly history, sexuality, and violence, and even on the evolution issue, where I largely agree with many of the people I interact with in the book, as I say, my evangelical colleagues and so forth. There are some important issues that I want to also address there, like the issues of the fall and original sin. So again, for instance, as an example, take the chapter on violence. I'm not interacting with Richard Dawkins. I'm interacting with Pete Enns and Greg Boyd and Eric Siebert, who are, fellow evangelical colleagues who take the Bible seriously, but with whom I have some disagreements on those topics.
That's helpful. Yeah, I was as I was reading it, I was struck by how there will probably be readers on different sides who will be upset by some position you take.
Yeah, there's something in there that'll make everybody upset with me.
Right.
I hope I hope that the tone that I struck will at least get them to think about the issues. And if they disagree with me, that's fine. But I just wanted to get some arguments out there.
Right. So about the Exodus, I think it's very common, at least in some of the commentaries that I've read, to kind of treat Exodus like, well, this is kind of a reconstruction, right, of these Jewish people trying to reconstruct their identity, their historical identity. And so try to treat this like some historical event is just that's not right. So I'm curious to hear why you think it matters that we treat Exodus like a historical event. Why can't we simply say this is just a group of people trying to find their identity?
Sure. Yeah, I think, first of all, I would judge the matter based on our understanding of the genre of the book and ask the question whether the original writer or writers were intending to talk about the past. And again, I think it is bound up with identity and who are we and all that, but that doesn't answer the question of whether it happened or not. But to me, the most important point to make is that that the Exodus story is presenting what I would call a track record for God on which the theology is based. It's presenting a picture of God as one who can deliver his people when we are beyond human help. And you can see in places like Psalm 77, later Israelites looking back and gaining confidence for their own troubled present and hope for the future based on on the crossing of the sea. And so, there are good stories that have important theological points. I mean, the parables. I think Job is a helpful, instructive story that it doesn't depend on whether there actually was a historical Job or not. But the Exodus story is part of the redemptive history, which is establishing a track record for God that has a big impact on the later generations. So to say that nothing like the Exodus actually happened, but it's still telling us about a God who can actually save us in our present seems to me paradoxical and contradictory.
Okay. What about this pushback that you frequently hear, which is something like this? Well, if this massive exodus really occurred, we don't have any archaeological evidence of anything like that. So what do you make of that?
Yeah. And I spend some time on this topic in my book, and I would begin by saying, we have to, first of all, be open to having some of our Sunday school portrayals of the Exodus questioned in terms of massive numbers moving up out of Egypt and so forth. But then secondly, I would simply say, well, we do have direct evidence of the Exodus, namely the testimony of Scripture itself. And on a more academic level, my colleagues Ian Prove and Phil Long and I address the topic of, using the Bible as testimony to the past in our book, A Biblical History of Israel. But again, I think that there's more indirect evidence for the Exodus than most people understand. And there's good reasons why we don't have, say, Egyptian evidence of the Exodus. Most notably that the Egyptians just aren't really that interested in recording their humiliating defeats unless they have an ultimate victory at the end of it.
Right.
So, they talk about the Hyksos coming in their accounts coming in the 16th century BC, but eventually they kick them out. So, I think it's an important question. And one other point, if I might make it, Sheb, is that I had this conversation, which I recount in my book, with evangelical scholar who has taken the view that it doesn't matter whether the Exodus happened, and precisely on the basis that you mentioned. And I said to him, well, I know you believe that the resurrection is historically true. And he goes, yeah, Jesus was raised in space and time. And I said, and there's no direct evidence of the resurrection that would satisfy the curiosity of a secular historian. And I said, why do you think that this is why are you asserting that it's, an historical event? And he replied by saying, well, look at the big effect that the resurrection had in the creation of the Christian church. And I said, yes, that's true. But look at the big effect that the Exodus had in the, what we were talking earlier about the Israelites finding their identity in the Exodus event. And then while I was just finishing the book, Richard Elliott Friedman, teaches at the University of Georgia, a Jewish Hebrew Bible scholar, came out with a book on the Exodus too, where he makes precisely that point. And so he too, and he's not a real conservative biblical scholar either, but he just says, it's hard to explain the impact of the Exodus tradition in the Bible and in Israelite history without something having happened.
I liked how you engage with the work of Peter Enns. And I liked that you dropped a little, just kind of, as an aside, I kind of chuckled when you said, and by the way, I was Peter Enns' professor.
I was his professor, and then I hired him as chair of the Old Testament department at Westminster, about which I'm still very proud and happy. And he's currently one of my best friends, but that doesn't mean we can't have significant differences, that we interact with each other in a loving, ironic way.
Yeah, yeah. To move on from Exodus, you also talk about one of the most, I mean, to me, one of the most difficult issues in the Bible, which is these Canaanite conquests.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about maybe how Christians have read those stories wrong, and maybe how Christians can read these stories a little bit more carefully?
Well, I mean, I think that it is a difficult theme and reality in the Bible, this idea of divine violence, particularly as we look back on the conquest. And I don't want to minimize the fact that we all struggle with, aspects of divine violence. But the two things that I try to emphasize in my book is, first of all, this is not an Old Testament versus New Testament thing. It's, when you look at particularly, say, the apocalyptic portions of the New Testament, specifically the book of Revelation and Jesus's own comments about his second coming in a place like Mark 13, they're filled with allusions to future divine violence. So that's the first thing I would point out. And in my book, I lay out, the way divine violence is presented from Genesis to Revelation. And I suggest that it's one coherent account of God's battle against evil, spiritual evil and human evil. And, but then the second important point is that God's violence is always connected with his judgment. And we just happen to live in a time in the 21st century West, in kind of a chronological and a geographical or cultural bubble, where the idea of God judging evil is problematic to many. It's not just the idea of divine violence like we're talking about now, but some people have a real aversion to the idea of hell being a place of torment or pain. Some people are questioning the idea of the substitutionary atonement picture of the cross in the New Testament. So I think we have to ask ourselves, are we reading the Bible, or are we trying to explain it away to kind of fit in with our own cultural expectations? Are we creating a God that isn't there? Pete, in his book, The Bible Tells Me So, Pete Enns, in his book, The Bible Tells Me So, talks about how in the Old Testament, the depicted God is not the actual God. And you just have to ask yourself, is this because we have a problem with the God who is depicted in the Old Testament? Are we picking and choosing God? And I would say, too, that, to be as autobiographical for a moment, Pete and I know each other's stories, and Pete grew up in a very, very conservative context where, God's judgment was emphasized and maybe even overemphasized. And I grew up in a very liberal Christian tradition where the God that I was presented with as a young person in church I was very comfortable with as a non-believer.
Yeah.
It took somebody sharing with me the idea that God might judge me for the sin I was committing that got me to consider entering into a serious relationship with God. So I think, I guess the point I'm making is that I think some people, maybe Greg Boyd, whose book I have the most difficulty with, because he, more than Pete, seems to really be working overtime to how do I put it? He's not really explaining the text as much as he's trying to solve a problem. The God that he's reading about in the Bible is not the God that he wants to or expects to find in the Bible. And so he works overtime to make it different. So those are a couple things that I would point out, and would hope that your listeners might read the book and get my more detailed arguments there.
Yeah, that's helpful. And then you also address this issue of sexuality. I've heard some people take issue with treating the Genesis account as a way of, telling us how we should live, because they say, well, the categories of creatures that we find there, it doesn't include all the categories of creatures. And so to what extent can the Genesis creation account be described as normative, do you think?
Oh, well, I think the creation account can be considered normative in the sense when we try to consider what is Genesis 1 and 2 trying to teach us, or 1 through 3 as well. But 1 and 2 would be more like where I go to find out what's God's intention in terms of, say, sex and gender and marriage and so forth. You have to ask the question, what is the text trying to teach? Which is the definition, by the way, of inerrancy, according to the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy. The Bible's true in everything that it intends to teach. Is it trying to teach us cosmology? I don't think so. Is it trying to teach us zoology? No, I don't think so. It's using ancient concepts of cosmology and zoology to teach us other matters. So, John Walton does a particularly good job on the cosmology side of it too, but I think it also would apply to zoology, where it does seem pretty, with the picture in Genesis 2 of the creation of creation, what I would call the creation of the first human being who's given the status of divine image bearer, and then followed by, a figurative depiction of the creation of the first woman, etc. It seems pretty intent on talking about issues of gender, sex, marriage, as well as other things, but those in particular as relates to the fourth part of my book. And then I would just add on the issue of sexuality and homosexuality in particular, the rest of the Old Testament and the rest of the New Testament are just consistent on that issue. So it's not, So, and again, I take a look at the relevant texts in some detail in my book, and also interact with, recent attempts to reinterpret those in a more affirming way, which I think are not at all persuasive.
Okay. So it sounds like you're saying, in response to the person who says, like, well, not every kind of animal is mentioned, that you're saying, like, well, yeah, that's fine. The Bible's not trying to teach us zoology. It's trying to teach us something else.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
What about this response? Your book is titled Confronting Old Testament Controversies. What about a Christian who says, well, look, here's an easy way to deal with all these controversies. Just say, Christians don't really need to follow the Old Testament, right? As Christians, we follow Jesus and the Gospels, and that's all in the New Testament. And Paul seems to talk about, this Mosaic law in such a way that it seems like that's done away with, or something like that. So what do you think about that as a response?
I think that's a serious error, to say the least, and doesn't honor what we learn in the New Testament either, right? I mean, Jesus says in Luke 24 that the whole Old Testament, well, of course, he doesn't use that term. He talks about scriptures or law and prophets, all anticipate is coming. Well, I'll just take Matthew 5:17 and following, not one jot or tittle of the law and the prophets, and specifically the commandments, are going to be done away with until they're accomplished. Some of them have been accomplished. There's a fulfillment of the sacrificial law, so we don't offer sacrifices anymore. Even so, Leviticus 1-7 remains relevant as an important theological background to Christ's death and other matters. But a lot of the Old Testament remains relevant. And if you just read the New Testament, you first of all won't understand the New Testament without the Old Testament background. I've often likened just reading the New Testament to, and my father actually did this when I was younger. For some reason, he never checked the time when movies would start. So when I was younger, he'd take us to the movies, more times than not, we'd show up 20 minutes before the end.
Oh, wow.
And we'd watch the end. And boy, it sure looked exciting, but I didn't know what was going on. So, and then we stayed through the intermission, then we'd watch the beginning. We'd get to the point where we came in. He goes, okay, this is where we came in. Let's go. And I'm going, so people who just read the New Testament can't really understand the New Testament. And let's remember, Jesus doesn't disown the Old Testament. He fully embraces it. And, I think we ought to listen to church history when, the Orthodox Church proclaimed a guy named Marcion a heretic for doing precisely that, disowning or unhitching from the Old Testament. And then, of course, Marcion became consistent and then started jettisoning parts of the New Testament, like Revelation, that were so much like what he was objecting to in the Old Testament.
Yeah, so you use the term that you have this concern about practical Marcionites.
Yeah, I don't think Enns or Boyd or Siebert are actual theological Marcionites, but the practical effect of their teaching changes the meaning of the Old Testament or even discourages our appropriation of parts of it. That's probably the sort of sternest comment I made about them. But I do appreciate them all. I mean, they're struggling with significant issues, and we need to have this discussion. So I appreciate them. Yeah. I think the worst thing we can do in these kind of debates is to demonize other people.
Yeah. Was there anything else, Tremper, that we should mention or that we should talk about that's important?
Yeah. The only thing I would say is we ought to be lifelong students. By we, I mean all Christians of the Scripture, and we should be open to having the interpretations that we've held challenged and to think things through. We need to remember that, as the Reformers taught in a place like the Westminster Confession of Faith, that not all things are clear in Scripture, but those matters that are fundamental to our salvation are taught in so many different ways that they're clear. But a whole bunch of other issues, we have room for discussion about them, and we shouldn't be afraid of honest discussion of them, as long as we hold on to the principal tenets of our faith as they're articulated in places like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think your desire to be faithful to the text rather than choosing a team comes across quite well in the book. So
thanks.
Yeah. I think Christians will find the book helpful, even if, there are some places where there might be some disagreements. I think the Christian community is really indebted to your contribution to Old Testament scholarship. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Yeah. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.